Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. And what is unfolding in the state of Texas right now is exceptional, but in all the profoundly wrong ways. Texas has now made abortion all but illegal for most pregnant women living within the state's boundaries, and with no exceptions for cases of rape or incest. On September 1st, a law went into effect in Texas, SB 8, a draconian, manipulative, and just plain diabolical law ensuring that all abortions after 6 weeks of gestation, a time when many women don't even know yet that they're pregnant, can be subject to lawsuits brought by any individual, anywhere, against anyone involved in an abortion procedure. That includes the patient, their medical provider, even the Lyft driver who gives a pregnant mom a ride to the clinic. And don't think that this vigilante approach to law enforcement wasn't deliberate. President Biden's Justice Department has filed a lawsuit and is seeking an injunction to stop SB 8 from becoming a reality. But many people who are watching what is unfolding in Texas are calling the lawsuit a long shot. And now, 6 other states, including Florida and Mississippi, are hoping to follow Texas's lead and pass similar and maybe even stricter abortion bans. Here in California, we thankfully have some of the strongest reproductive pro-choice rights in the United States, including a right to privacy enshrined in our state's constitution. But even in our blue, liberal California, there are still numerous barriers to accessing reproductive health services that we need to breach to truly be a reproductive freedom state. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk about the short and long-term impact of SB 8 in Texas, not to mention the law's potentially pernicious impact on communities of color and low-income communities, the significance of the U.S. High Court's willingness to give its blessing for the new law's birth and viability, California's continued push to secure its pro-choice reputation, and also, what do laws like SB 8 in Texas say about how we view women who are pregnant, their health, their right to choice, and their very sense of self? Well, to talk about all of these sobering issues, we are proud to have joining us on the podcast again, State Senator Lena Gonzalez, who represents California's 33rd Senate District, which includes her hometown of Long Beach. Senator Gonzalez is, of course, a member of both the Legislative Women's Caucus and the Legislative Latino Caucus. She is also the chair of the Senate Transportation Committee. The 2021 legislative session is over, so Senator Gonzalez is back in her district in Long Beach, which is where we find her now. Senator Lena Gonzalez, great to talk to you again. Welcome back.
Hi, Brian. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate that very much.
Absolutely. It's good to hear your voice. Summer is over. Fall is here. It's Long Beach Grand Prix season. How you doing? How are things going down there?
It is great. You know, we had a great Grand Prix weekend. That's our gem of an event for Long Beach. But the district's going well, thankfully, and just great to be back and have a really successful legislative season.
And I know you are the mom of 3 growing boys and back in school, Lord willing, thankfully. How are they doing?
They are doing great. Thank you so much for asking. Yes, that's my first job as mom. And so my 6-year-old is in first grade. He's loving it. We've got a middle schooler and then a community college kid. So they're all doing really, really well despite, these last 2 years. They're just glad to be back in school, connecting with their friends and learning, which I feel really good about.
Absolutely. I'm sure mom is breathing a sigh of relief, too.
Yes.
Well, looking back at the just concluded legislative session a couple of weeks ago, this end-of-session ritual seemed to have a less, shall we say, cataclysmic conclusion than previous session ends. And I know for you in particular, it was a very fruitful term, bringing to reality one of your key policy proposals, which was broadband for all. So congratulations. Just give us a brief reference on some of the successes you had for this session, including broadband for all.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you. I mean, you've been great at highlighting broadband for all. The governor signed SB 156, which was the budget trailer bill allotting $6 billion in broadband infrastructure. Now we're just hopefully, fingers crossed, waiting for him to sign SB 4 and then the companion Assembly Bill 14 that will further provide more equity as it pertains to broadband to ensure that telcos and small and large internet service providers are certainly investing in rural California and urban California, regardless of someone's zip code or income. So we're looking forward to that. It seems promising, which is great.
Tequity, I think, was what you used to call it in your days at Microsoft, right? And in the city council. That's
right. And we're still looking forward to that. Yeah, that was a big topic this year, and we're just glad that it's gone this far. And we've had all the stakeholders at play, and they've done such amazing work with us.
Well, the other thing that happened, of course, this fall that everybody seems to be breathing a sigh of relief on, at least on our side, and the dust settling on this controversial recall election from earlier this month as we speak. There were some fears that hung in the balance for the future of the state on the eve of the recall vote, but ultimately it was overwhelmingly decided in Governor Newsom's favor. You are actually the first lawmaker that I've spoken to since this recall ended, so being the captive audience, you are here for the moment. With the couple of weeks' time now for reflection on this and the chance to put this recall season into perspective, what's your opinion now on how this wound up? And how should Governor Newsom, how should California move forward? Lessons learned? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks for the question. You know, after a couple weeks, and I think I've always been of the mindset that this recall was really ridiculous. I think in addition to how you might feel as a Democrat or Republican or an independent, you know, the fact that taxpayers footed the bill for almost $300 million, I think was extraordinary, number one. And there's his reelection next year. So I often reminded folks as I was talking to them, if they wanted my opinion, it was just a fair opinion, that this was, in that sense, you know, very unfair to the taxpayers, whether you like the governor or not. Now, I think he's done a phenomenal job. He's done a great job. We've worked very, very well with him. I would say the reflections moving forward is hopefully to be able to reunite some of the Californians who have been very divided on these issues, and it's sort of taken a side, and it took a nasty turn, I think, in terms of politics here in California as it pertains to racial justice, economic justice, women's rights, reproductive freedoms. I mean, it really took a nasty turn of what it could have been if he were recalled. So I'm glad that he's in office. I'm glad we continue to work with him and his administration to continue the progress on those issues. And I know that there are a lot of even Republican friends of mine who feel the same way, that they're just glad that we have this stability now and that we can move forward. And there are questions as well. I've got a lot of constituents who have asked me about the recall process. And I know there are some legislators working on that. And so I look forward to see, you know, what that might unfold into down the road.
Well, thank you for helping me there to a degree and the transition to the topic at hand. I know California has some of the strongest reproductive rights on record, many rights that are enshrined into our state's constitution. So worst case, a new Trump-branded conservative governor couldn't have thwarted those rights overnight. But a new, not progressive governor could veto future reproductive rights legislation, cut state budget funding to important programs, enact some very suppressive policies through state agencies, and even empower a fellow lawmaker or activist to try and copy and paste into our law books something resembling the threatening and suppressive anti-abortion law that we've seen in Texas. Are these reproductive rights here in California and privacy policies that we have in place that fragile? And could those fears have been realized if this recall in this particular case had gone a different way or in the future?
Yes, and I think this is a very important point. Is I think it, even though, to your point, if it didn't happen overnight, there are issues and policies that could have been put in place by this governor through the administration, as you mentioned, through the budget process, vetoing bills that were for reproductive rights. There's so many different things. I also think about appointments that could have been made during that time. That could have been appointments, although the Senate confirms them here in California. I think even just putting someone up for an appointment potentially could have been very detrimental to the issue of reproductive rights for Californians, and also mirroring what Texas had done, which in my opinion goes way too far. And so we don't want to be that state. We've never been known to be that state. And I think the candidates on the other side took very hardline positions against reproductive rights and really against just women in general, and making sure that they knew that women, it almost was a narrative that women were a class less than and a gender less than. And that's not exactly where we're moving towards in terms of California and our rights. And so Governor Newsom has had that support for many, many years. He's talked about women's reproductive rights through his first partner as well. We've talked about it in the Women's Caucus. He's been very open about that and ensuring that we're progressing towards more abortion care services, towards a budget that actually speaks to our values. And so all of that would, I think, have gone backwards and really would have been, again, a detriment to our state if somebody else had been elected that was taking a hardline position against it.
Let me do a deep dive more into your reaction to Senate Bill 8 in Texas and its already anticipated effect on abortion rights in Texas and nationally.
This is, again, what's scary. I think that there have been legislators in other states, as in Texas and some other states as well, that are now starting to build alliances together and trying to emulate each other's policies. And I mean, going as far as suing someone, if I wanted to go get an abortion and suing, say, my mother or my father or my husband or my friend who's just driving me to the clinic, I think is really gone too far. And so we've taken the opposite direction with a few bills, of course, one of which is my colleague, Assemblymember Rebecca Barracan, which basically says we want to protect the rights. We want to protect the privacy of people that are going to these clinics by ensuring that they're not being filmed and that their privacy is protected, which is ultimately their health privacy. California leads in privacy issues, right? And this is one other thing to lead on. So it's scary to think of what may come next from this alliance of anti-choice type states and the legislatures that have just kind of gone along. And unfortunately, it's been a lot of male legislators that have been doing this work. And so it's just
that's true.
One other unfortunate circumstance that we're seeing right now. But California will continue pushing back.
One of the deeper concerns about this law has been about the brunt of it most deeply impacting communities of color and low-income communities. And today, more than half of those who have abortions live below the federal poverty line. So these folks will likely not have the resources or freedom to rapidly seek confirmation of a pregnancy or access to a prompt abortion procedure appointment or the financial resources to travel to other states or jurisdictions where an abortion can be provided legally. So this may sound glib, but does this bill ensure that only the privileged amongst Texans and by extension Americans, if this goes farther, can get access to reproductive care?
Right. That's absolutely what it says. Not explicitly, but that is exactly what it's doing. And we've known this. I mean, there are a lot of people that are in poverty that just have children already, don't want other children for whatever reason, their choice. And so they want to go get an abortion, and they should have that opportunity to do so without any barriers. And this is putting mountains of barriers in front of these women that are in poverty, that may have less access to health clinics and to education as somebody with means. And so this is exactly what it's doing. And it's unfortunate. And we see the same thing here in California. And what we've tried to do in California, just the opposite, is ensuring that women not only have the right to access a clinic for an abortion should they need one, but also hopefully lowering the barriers of cost to that. And I had a bill, SB 245, that would have basically said we didn't want any cost sharing and any deductible, so we can equal the playing field. So all women, regardless of their income, zip code, socioeconomic status, were able to get the reproductive health care that they needed. And we know more often than not, as to your point, that it's a lot of women of color that are seeking these services. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Let's talk briefly about your legislation. Obviously, as we've said, California is strong in its rights and its guarantee of privacy in the Constitution. Give us some more details on your legislation. I know you've had to table it. Give us a little more detail about what it would require in terms of coverage for abortion services here in California and what stymied you here in this last session and moving it forward.
So SB 245 was a bill that was sponsored and in collaboration with friends at Planned Parenthood and NARAL and many local grassroots organizations, one for Black maternal health, another for Latina reproductive justice. And so lots of organizations came forward because I think we knew that something like Texas would happen, unfortunately, and that's unfortunately what occurred and what we are dealing with now. But SB 245, as mentioned, would remove all cost-sharing requirements for abortion care among all state licensed health plans and insurers so that no one in California is unable to access abortion care because of cost. We know that it costs anywhere from around $50 to $75 upwards to $1,200, $1,500, just depending on where you go and what type of insurance you may or may not have. And so the bill would have applied to all health plan enrollees and also covered spouse and dependents as well. And so it unfortunately became a little bit controversial towards the end. I was glad that we got at least a couple of the privacy abortion bills through, but this one would have been really significant because we know that there are so many women that need the support, that need the help, and that this would have equaled the playing field for them. And we knew also that Texas would be doing this unfortunate backward sort of types of policies, anti-choice policies that we know in SB 8. And so this is every reason that we've wanted SB 245 to move forward in California. It didn't make it, but that doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to push next year. And I would hope that we would still do that. And actually, there's a lot of marches going forward. There's going to be one here in Long Beach, Los Angeles, across the nation. Lots of advocates are going to be loud and bold and marching in the streets to ensure that we get this abortion equity move forward and ensure that we're not subscribing to any of the anti-choice legislation that these states are subscribing to.
Well, looking at this from a California perspective, there are fears in the wake of the new Texas law, or if laws like SB 8 are enacted elsewhere, and especially, worst case scenario, if Roe v. Wade is somehow overturned down the line, we could see our healthcare system in California overwhelmed by patients from other states traveling here for abortions. In fact, I had read that last year more than 7,000 out-of-state patients came to Planned Parenthood clinics here in California to get the care that they were unable to obtain in their own home state. Do you fear or anticipate seeing many women from Texas coming to California to seek a legal abortion?
And another great point, Brian, that is already happening. And I think that hasn't been highlighted as much until recently, until these bills, the anti-choice bills started popping up throughout the legislature. And so this has already been occurring, unfortunately, because California has been a state that has wanted equity when it comes to reproductive freedom and health, and we're super pro-choice, and we want to make sure that people feel welcomed and that they have that access to health equity, again, regardless of where they're coming from. But we've seen this already happening. So this is why we need to be loud and clear, and we need to continue to push the agenda and legislation next year, and also just be at the national level, too. I think there's a lot of our House members and Congress members and U.S. senators that are also pushing the envelope as it pertains to reproductive health freedom that we've never seen before. And it's a really good conversation right now that they're having and ensuring that there are freedoms at every level of government and ensuring that there's a national framework and discussion about this so we don't have Texas and other states continuing these anti-choice pieces of legislation. So more work to be done, as mentioned, and I know that there's just a lot of work in this space that I don't think we've ever done before, but we need to continue to do here in California.
Reflecting a bit on the situation that's facing a woman who is pregnant in Texas right now, there was actually a story in the San Francisco Chronicle this past week, maybe you saw it, profiling 3 pregnant women from Texas who, since SB 8 became law earlier in September, have made this 3 to 6 hour drive north to a clinic in Oklahoma City to have an abortion because they are at or past the SB 8 6-week gestation period. And at that Oklahoma clinic, they were treated by this OBGYN who was also far from home, Dr. Rebecca Taub, who practices in the East Bay here in California, who's now making regular trips, volunteering her time at this clinic in Oklahoma City, and is performing dozens of abortions over the course of a couple of days every time she goes to Oklahoma. So the women who have abortions have to keep their trip and their procedure secret, sometimes from the judgment of their family. So there you have 3 Texas women, an Oklahoma clinic, and a California doctor. And that is the landscape that we feared and the scenario that we are seeing unfolding in the wake of the enactment of this law. And even Oklahoma is considering enacting an abortion ban law, similar to the one in Texas. So does it scare you to think what can happen and is happening to pregnant women living in Texas who may discover maybe 6 weeks too late that they're pregnant and want to consider an abortion? What could happen to them? That must be a sobering thought as well.
Absolutely. And again, this goes back to health equity. If you don't have the right type of insurance, if you're on state-subsidized insurance like we have here in Medi-Cal, maybe you don't have insurance, you're not going to know oftentimes that you're actually pregnant until perhaps maybe even after 6 weeks. And so that is it is a sobering thought to know that these women are trekking so far just to have an access to their own choices for their own body. And it's unfortunate that they have to do that, or that they have to feel that they have to come to California in order to feel that they are provided equity with just the health services that should be provided to everyone. And so the fact that many states bordering Texas are doing the same thing again is very scary to think about. This is why I think California, as like we often say, we are one of the largest economies, but so goes California, so goes the nation in some cases. And so this
Right.
is why California stands to be a very, very vocal leader and continue to be a vocal leader, but also just continue to advocate at the national level. And it's not just for us. Again, it's for so many women and Americans across the country that are facing these dire straits just to access reproductive health. And so if you think this is bad, it's also the same thing with contraceptives. It's also the same thing with other services related to Planned Parenthood, even for LGBTQ health. And so there's all of these different supplementary issues that come about it. We're talking just about abortion care, but there's so many other services that are being locked out as well with these same states. And so that's another unfortunate circumstance.
I covet your reaction and opinion on the U.S. Supreme Court shadow docket decision earlier this month that some say was equally as shocking as the creation and implementation of SB 8 itself, refusing to stop the new Texas law from going into effect. What do you think is the long-term impact of the court's decision, not just on Texas, but nationwide?
Well, yeah, I mean, now that there's a more conservative Supreme Court, it's very nerve-wracking to feel what could be the next stage in terms of not just is Texas' decision, but this is inching towards, of course, Roe v. Wade, a ruling from 40 years ago, plus years ago, and knowing that more states are now feeling emboldened to be able to create these same sort of laws and inch towards basically eradicating Roe v. Wade as it stands. And so it's a very nerve-wracking place to be, to know that this is where our courts are headed, potentially where legislation is landing. And we know that our federal administration feels very differently. And we know that there are a lot of states that need to speak up as well to ensure that they know, not just California, but places like Oregon and Washington that are more pro-choice states that need to coalesce with California to make our voices heard collectively, as well as, the other side is doing. It's just a really tough situation to be, but this is why we legislate with these bills.
I wanted to ask you, too, about our perception about the procedure of abortion. Recent data has showed that rates of unintended pregnancy and abortion have declined in the last 20 years, and with that has sprung up this dubious assumption that abortion has become kind of a niche procedure, like cosmetic surgery, for which there isn't much need, and in the future there'll be less need, that women in the new millennium are so much freer, more equal, they have birth control options galore, so much more than they had in 1973 when Roe came along. So abortion access, in a lot of people's opinions, doesn't need to be priority. And that sounds like, even in an egalitarian society, women still want control of their reproductive rights. So this attitude, to me, sounds patronizing at best and harmful at worst.
Oh, absolutely. I think it should be neither here nor there what somebody wants to do with their own body. It should not be anybody else's business. What I do, what my neighbor wants to do with their body should be up to them solely and completely. And this has gone into a conversation now, again, with mostly male legislators telling women what they should do with their own bodies. And depending on which state you're in, you have the opportunity to have an abortion or you don't. And it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. It's kind of enlightened a lot of folks because they think, oh, you're a Democrat, you're all for abortion care. But there are a lot of Republican women as well that I've talked to that have said, yes, I'm pro-choice and I believe in this. And we shouldn't have this divided narrative. And women across the board, regardless of your political affiliation, should have the opportunity to choose what they need to do. So it has gotten to such a level of disdain with so many women, I can tell you, again, from various income levels, backgrounds, et cetera. And we're going to see them marching on the streets, and it'll be just very interesting to see where this conversation lies. But I think at the end of the day, it's a topic that we need to get a handle on at the national level because, again, we're going to come up against some legislatures that have just been after reproductive rights, but again, in the same vein of against LGBTQ rights, against contraceptives. It doesn't matter what it is. It just seems like it's against all of these righteous things that people need access to, just the average American needs access to. So, yeah, it's an ongoing conversation, and I think we've seen the decline as well of abortions. It's not, I would say, a niche. People think it's cosmetic surgery or whatever they're going to categorize it as.
Right.
It's a woman's health decision, and it should be up to her to decide. So, yeah, I think it's been completely disrespected, and I think women are have just about had it. And this is now 40 years.
Right. That's exactly right. You bring up a good point here. In those 40 years, there's been some criticism even of liberals and progressives who for decades have made abortion rights and pro-choice values the centerpiece of a feminist privacy and reproductive rights agenda, that they have done too little up to now to insulate Roe and its historic rights from a U.S. Supreme Court that could be and is now conservative and anti-abortion. Now, hindsight is always 20/20, but should we have done more under the three Democratic presidents we've had over the past 40 years, Carter, Clinton, Obama, to try and codify Roe instead of leaving it all at the mercy of the politics, even though they don't like to say that, the politics of the high court?
Absolutely. I definitely think we should have done more. I mean, I think we're still fighting women's rights, obviously, for many different discussions, even outside of reproductive health. And so, absolutely, because you just don't know what is going to live past the next president or the next legislature, the next Supreme Court. And so it's something we should have been focused on much earlier in our days, but we had not been. And so we're in this space now of catching up after the fact and just hoping that this federal administration will be a saving grace. But we know that that's just one component of the many facets that this takes. It's obviously our Supreme Court that's involved in this, lower courts. We also have legislatures that are anti-choice. And so it's just lots of dynamics that we should have factored in that we just did not at this time. But I'm also just really empowered by having a woman vice president who understands these issues, who's been in front of these issues as well, and I know will continue to fight for us. And it's also great that she's from California, but she's been in this fight as well, and I just look forward to seeing what sort of manifests from that and where her voice could be a little bit louder in this regard as well.
You've talked about Kamala Harris and women recently in higher power, women in Congress and in other state houses, stepping out on the ledge and taking a risk on codifying Roe and pushing this pro-choice abortion legislation. Is it difficult for you as a legislator, as a lawmaker, to take this deep breath kind of risk, for you to be out there speaking up and staking a claim on this issue and advocating and expressing opinions? I mean, you could say, well, my position as a state leader and my advocacy role and the fragility of the current time compels me to do this, but easier said than done sometimes.
Yeah, and that's a great question as well. And I think a lot of women I've seen in Congress, not even just stepping out on the issue. I think we've all known that mostly we've been supportive of codifying Roe v. Wade and being supportive of women's reproductive health, but you've seen a lot of Congress members and elected leaders sharing their experiences having gone through an abortion that I don't think we've ever seen before. And so it's been very enlightening and also very bold of them to actually trust the public with this information. I think it's a unique time right now where we're seeing very personal stories come forward that I think are so brave. But on top of that, being a Latina, it's hard too for my community sometimes because we do have a religious factor that is often factored in. And so I know that just some time ago, the Vatican and I believe our Catholic leaders vilified a lot of elected leaders for taking a position on abortion. And I don't subscribe to that. I am a Catholic, but I also believe in a person's opportunity to choose. And I believe in health equity so much that, I don't subscribe to the notion that someone shouldn't have received communion just because they took a position on abortion. And I know that's a sticky topic for elected leaders who are also very religious, but it's also something that I think is the right thing to do, in my opinion. So it's hard. It's always very hard putting yourself out there because of what you may have grown up with personally, but I also believe in what's right for the betterment of people that I represent and doing the most amount of good for the most amount of people, which I think is what we're elected to do.
You had told me in one of your first podcast visits about your earlier journey as a college student and being single and pregnant with your first son. And you said it really wasn't like being a single mom in the truest sense of the word because you weren't alone. You got along well with your son's dad. You had support from your family. But during that time, did you find yourself grateful or having some extra peace of mind knowing that you were living in a state at that time in your life with that situation that you were in all of a sudden that gave you agency and freedom over your own reproductive choices?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been very transparent with that. I was a very young mom and I decided to have my child. But if I didn't, I had an opportunity here in California, and I don't want to call it an opportunity in that sense, but there is a support system in California that would have afforded me the opportunity to make my own decision. And I had doctors who were very open and transparent with asking me what I wanted to do. And so I felt comfortable in making that decision. I made my decision. I have a beautiful, almost 21-year-old son who I love very dearly.
That's wonderful.
And it's wonderful to think that as a young mother, I had the choice to make on my own, not anyone else's, not even his father, my choice to make, right? But it was my choice. And so what I want is for every other woman, whether young, older, wherever you're at in your life, to have that same choice. And for our doctors and for our whole healthcare system to be in that same sort of mindset that this is that woman's choice to make, and we'll support her regardless of what that choice is, regardless of our personal opinions, regardless of what anyone else thinks. This is her choice. And so I would hope that, of course, will continue here in California, as it will, but I would hope that continues in other states, and that we stop the gridlock and stop politicking with women's bodies, and that we just see the decisions for what they are. They're personal decisions that shouldn't be intruded on by anyone else.
Thank you so much for feeling comfortable enough to share that personal perspective. And I realize there's really no clean end to this story of pro-choice and abortion rights here in the U.S., and that there could be some messy legal future coming up, if not for California, at least for the rest of the country. But I appreciate your perspective and the work that you're doing to move us forward as a reproductive state. And I appreciate you being part of this.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate you, too. Thanks for having me, and thank you for allowing us to talk about this. Very important.
Senator Lena Gonzalez, representing the 33rd Senate District in Southern California. And that wraps this edition of Then There's California. We are proud to have technical and production assistance from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulty, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Saviniano, Gunjan Patel, John Roman, McLeana Woods, Ricardo Sainz-Ione, and the graphic artistry talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of State Senator Lena Gonzalez of Long Beach, I'm Brian Green from the state capitol in Sacramento, and thanks for listening to Then There's California.